Shaw, thank you very much for joining our interview series.
Well, thank you.
I want to start right away with the first question.
Okay, go ahead.
Given the historical context of South Korea's democracy, emerging from a period of severe anti-communism and anti-Japanese sentiment, what historical and socio-political factors have contributed to the rise of populism and authoritarian tendencies in South Korea? How have anti-Japanism and anti-communism shaped the South Korean politics as two dueling antagonisms?
Right. So I will say South Korea has emerged from a long period of Cold War classic anti-communism. The anti-Japanism is a relatively newer thing, and it has gotten worse over time. And I see it as a response to anti-communism becoming a threat to left-wing parties in South Korea in broad strokes, and them needing an equivalent emotional trigger to change the conversation, because North Korea is obviously right there, and for better or worse, they have, they're a liberal party. They're left-leaning parties in South Korea tend to get associated with North Korea. There are a lot of reasons why that happens, but well, obviously, any party advocating kind of redistributive welfare state is going to get accusations from the other side, just as you do in Europe, people saying, oh, this is socialism. In South Korea, the way that some left-leaning parties have fought back against that is by using a different vision of redistribution that looks at taking wealth that has accumulated through ill deeds, through the colonial era or through the military dictatorship, and trying to redistribute that to the country as a whole. So rather than saying we're taking from the rich and giving to the poor, they sometimes say, well, this person's grandfather worked for the colonial authorities, and therefore we're taking that money and redistributing it to the country for the benefit of the nation. So it's an interesting way to get around the classic problem of leftists being accused of being communist. I don't know if it's necessarily a healthy way to get around it, as we can see from different recent phenomena. But so yeah, that's a roundabout way of addressing this. Also, the authoritarian tendencies aspect, you have to consider the role of the United States over time, for decades, propping up fairly authoritarian military dictators in the South and saying, no, this sort of thing is necessary in order to stand as a bulwark against communism. That has given people, fairly centrist people, the idea that things like the national security law and a certain amount of government censorship is necessary for the safety and security of the state, which I think is easier to get away with in a country that has an immediate threatening neighbor like South Korea does.
All right. How do populist leaders in South Korea typically frame their rhetoric and policies to resonate with the populace? What messaging and discourse strategies do they employ to appeal to the grievances of the people they intend to exploit? For example, how do different factions utilize historical events and symbols to shape their political messaging? Is there any indication of an eagerness to move beyond colonial history?
Great question. There are a lot of symbols. Symbols are very important in South Korean politics for both the left and the right. In South Korea, traditionally, I would say that the left wing tends to appeal more using symbols related to traditional culture, there are a few left-wing politicians who tend to show up wearing a traditional Korean hanbok and give speeches in front of historical site related to the pre-modern Korean past, or they'll have like behind them a bunch of young schoolgirls dressed in the traditional costumes, and so they tend to. It may sound counterintuitive from a European perspective, but it's the progressive left that appeals more to, traditional values and traditional art forms, and the conservative right is much more, modernist, kind of brutalist. Everybody wearing suits and ties, and we're doing business, we're raising the economy and building semiconductors, and they don't have a lot of patience for the kind of raucous, religious and traditional dancing and culture that the more left-wing activists tend to employ. So it might sound kind of counterintuitive to us, but I have noticed that. There's also a lot of symbolism that the left wing uses in response to recent tragedies, like the Sewol ferry, which just had its 10th year anniversary of that tragic ferry sinking. So there's a symbol associated with that of the yellow ribbon that is, if you go to downtown Seoul, there has for years been a very prominent display of yellow ribbons surrounding a shrine to the students. And the interesting thing is, there was another tragedy that struck young people 2 years ago in the Halloween crush in Itaewon, in the center of Seoul, where a lot of young people were crushed to death at a party. And in South Korea, when a tragedy like this happens, people tend to look to the very top leadership for blame or responsibility, far more than I think people would normally do in America. So both the ferry incident and the Itaewon crush incident, people wear these yellow ribbons, and it's seen as an activist response directly challenging the current president, who in both cases happened to be a conservative president. So you see that yellow ribbon symbol and oh, these people are probably progressives, or at the very least, they don't like the current president, which is a weird connection to make from a tragedy that involved, lax regulations over many years being attributed to the current president. But that's the way things tend to happen. On the right, there are certain far right groups that have weaponized this kind of anti-feminist movement. Men's rights tends to be is becoming more of a symbol. There's an online community called Ilbe in South Korea that's openly far right, mostly associated with anti feminism, but also anti-immigrant. They're kind of the trolls of South Korea, and they can influence the political conversation on the extreme right. As far as colonial history, yes, on the right, everything right of center in Korea would very much like to move beyond colonial history. That's not a winning message for them, rightly or wrongly. They're still the right-wing politicians tend to be more associated with that history and with being descended from collaborators. Interestingly, actually, a lot of politicians on both sides have family connections to collaborators, but still the progressive left tends to feel very comfortable telling those stories and remembering that past. And it's important to remember the past, to not forget it. But it becomes a political tool of reliving the past through very personal histories and blame by association of, whose grandfather did what during the colonial era. And on the right side, they get back by saying, whose grandfather did what during the Korean War, or whose family has connections to North Koreans and things like that. So you see these two dueling kind of weaponizations of history on both sides. So I think both sides have their moments in history that they would rather forget, but but they mutually always keep that in the conversation.
From a historical perspective, how have populist and authoritarian tendencies impacted democratic institutions and processes in South Korea, including governance, civil liberties, rule of law, and the broader implications for democracy in the country?
So, as I mentioned, the military dictatorship period from the post-war all the way through the 1980s, supported by the US as a bulwark against encroaching communism, that kind of set up this society that was accustomed to the government cracking down on various aspects of public speech, subcultures like hippie culture, rock and roll, controlling a lot of what people could read and putting people in jail for owning certain books. All of those classic authoritarian boxes get checked in that period. And you can, I suppose, make the argument that even before that, in the Japanese era, that built a framework of authoritarianism in the country that they never really got over. You could make that argument. I'm not sure the historical connection is really valid, but definitely there have been few times before 1986 when South Koreans could openly say what they wanted without fear of reprisal. And unfortunately, in the democratic era, I think the progressive politicians that have emerged on the left sometimes tend to mimic these features, these authoritarian features, not to as severe of a degree, but you see politicians using the same playbook sometimes of, for instance, there was the national security law that would punish people for making statements seemingly praising North Korea or supporting North Korea. Now the left side politicians have tried to propose a law that would punish people for misrepresenting or falsely depicting the period of Japanese colonial rule or the period of the democratic movements, the Kwangju massacre under the military dictatorship, which of course you don't want people to be promoting false historical views. But what the law would actually do is allow governments to very selectively decide what is, what sort of history is acceptable, which you can see how that would be easily weaponized by either side. So there are these things like the national security law that are sort of entrenched and very difficult to get rid of. And then there are also tendencies to, like I said, guilt by association, I think, is a very entrenched idea in South Korean society. That, if your parents or your grandparents were part of something bad, that you should at the very least not be benefiting from what they did, and that leads to a lot of kind of permissiveness towards punishing people for family connections, friends connections, and also on the other side, it gives, I think, political and business leaders a feeling that it's okay to benefit cronies, to help out cronies, because they're going to get punished anyway. You're all going to get punished together if it goes wrong. So you might as well enrich each other while you can. I think that is a tendency that's very entrenched in South Korean politics.
All right. In its 2024 democracy report, the WeDem Institute of Sweden ranked South Korea under Mr. Yoon as one of the 42 countries undergoing autocratization. What factors have contributed to the autocratization of South Korea under Mr. Yoon?
Yeah, so I read the report, and I have to say, I agree with their conclusion, but I question their internal logic of how they got there. From what I read, it seems like they're reaching the conclusion that a transition from a progressive administration to a conservative one automatically counts as democratic backsliding. And also they mentioned that Yoon's predecessor, Moon Jae-in, was a human rights lawyer in the 80s, and they kind of don't say a whole lot else about him, which of course makes it seem as if there's this great human rights lawyer getting replaced by a right-wing leader who has made some efforts to prosecute his predecessor's administration. That's certainly true, but it's a very one-sided view of what's going on. South Korean democracy is in trouble. It's not backsliding yet, but there are tendencies on both sides to punish their opponents when they're in power, and then to distribute benefits to cronies. And also, the Moon administration had some pretty harsh restrictions on freedom of speech from the point of view of the North Korean human rights movement, North Korean defectors trying to talk about North Korea in a negative way. The Moon Jae-in administration really didn't like that because they were pushing for the promotion of closer inter-Korean ties, and they knew that if they let these activists speak out, North Korea would get mad. So they imposed some roundabout and direct limitations on how easy it was for certain reports to get published, for certain people to write their memoirs or to talk about their experience on TV. Those things all got reversed as soon as Yoon came into power. So now you have another golden age of people talking about North Korean human rights abuses, but it's very difficult to talk about any efforts to promote inter-Korean relations. So neither side is doing really well as far as freedom of speech, but they each have their kind of preferred speech that they want to hear. And I would say Korean politics for a long time has had an issue with less than free journalism, a lot of issues with media access. Certain media groups that give favorable reporting tend to get more access, and there are clear biases. There are most major media organizations in Korea have a known association with one side or the other. I don't think there's really a good centrist media. So the party in power tends to reward the media that's friendly with their party. And that happens with both sides. So in long story short, the transition from Moon to Yoon, yes, it was a transition from a left-wing leader to a right-wing leader. I don't think that by itself is a problem, but the deeper problem is widespread just disappointment, disenchantment with the political process in general, no matter who's in charge, and a feeling that the current president is responsible for everything bad that happens, leading to very quick transitions back and forth to, one party being in charge and then very quickly falling from favor, as we see now. Yoon just lost massively in this election. Yoon's party lost massively in the election last week. So By VDOM's calculations, I suppose they would see that as a positive turnaround on the surface. But if you look at what happened in this past election, it was really messy. So I'll just leave it at that. But yeah, there's a lot going on.
All right. How has nationalism been used during the election campaign, both by the People Power Party and the opposition, the Democratic Party? Can you elaborate on specific strategies or actions taken by these parties to maintain their political relevance? Furthermore, could you assess the role of these strategies in recent elections?
Nationalism. Yeah, so I would say both parties have made nationalist appeals to the electorate. In this most recent election, I think it was more focused on domestic issues than the regional tensions, just because of the way that there were some serious domestic contentions going on that kind of drove the message. The Conservative Party, the People's Power Party, did some things toward the beginning of this election cycle that kind of smelled of kind of anti-North Korea, nationalist message. There was a brief story where they warned, the People's Power Party warned that they had seen signs that North Korea was trying to interfere with the election. And they alleged that it might try an attack, some sort of cyber attack. And it's unknown if this was based on any real information or if it was an attempt to ramp up the fear factor towards North Korea. And there was also a story I read recently that the same party issued a directive to the regional election centers to promote, to push an anti-North Korea message in this campaign. But then it was that directive was resisted by some of the regional candidates for whatever reason. They didn't think that was a winning message. So that's a change, if that's true, from I would say the previous two General Assembly elections, where both sides were pretty enthusiastically talking about nationalist, messages of vis-a-vis the North Korean threat and the Japanese. This most recent election, maybe they sensed that people were getting tired of it, or maybe they just had more productive messages based on the economy that they wanted to try. But either way, this most recent election I saw as mostly as relatively more focused on domestic, internal, and economic issues than the previous ones.
Right. In one of your past articles, you applied securitization theory to analyze how domestic actors construct foreign threats, particularly concerning Japan and North Korea, within South Korean politics. Could you elaborate on how these securitizing speech acts contribute to the dueling antagonisms of anti-Japanism and anti-communism, and what implications they hold for political rhetoric and decision-making in the country?
Yes. So in that paper, I argued that politicians don't just talk about the North Korean threat in reaction to actions by North Korea or anti-Japanese rhetoric in response to actions by the Japanese, but they also tend to use the rhetoric reactively in response to criticism from the other side. So if North Korea attacks or does some sort of provocative action at the border, the people immediately look to the left-wing politicians, and they're expected to kind of be on a defensive stance because of their association, rightly or wrongly. They're expected to take a hit for that. And in response, you see them reaching for Japan as a way to say, well, we have a better reputation dealing with Japan issues. Are you really going to trust these other people that are being so cozy with Japan? And I see this on the right as well. When there was the trade war, trade dispute about 5 years ago now with Japan, and Japan was in the news a lot during that time. Similarly, people looked to the political right wing and expected them to take a hit for that because they're associated with promoting better ties with Japan. And you saw some right-wing politicians pivoting to North Korea and saying, well, what about them? Aren't they a bigger threat? What this does when people instinctively reach for their comfort zone, I suppose, is that it keeps both Japan and North Korea always in the public eye. When Japan does something, they talk about North Korea. When North Korea does something, they talk about Japan. So, internally, politicians can't control what either of those countries are going to do, but it causes them to react in ways that keep the conversation focused on those external threats in more so than sometimes is warranted. There's also the excessive scrutiny on family relations, which I talked about, and past history gets brought up every election cycle, which keeps kind of the memories of that history fresh and allows the sense of grievance to grow. Now, of course, you don't want to forget about the lessons of history, but imagine if, I'm trying to think of a European example, if there was a really competitive party in Belgium today that had a past history of being kind of descended from helping the helping the Nazi party. And then, they would always be associated, if any news came up about the Nazi atrocities, like they would always kind of be associated with that by association. It's a little bit similar. So the past history can never be forgotten because the political conversation tends to keep bringing it up.
Right. How will the elections held last week influence the political landscape in terms of right-wing and left-wing populism? Does the surge in populist movements in Europe have any impact on South Korean populism? What are the potential avenues for countering the challenges posed by populism and authoritarianism and strengthening democratic norms in South Korea?
Referring to the, I'm sorry, can you repeat that again?
Sure.
Yeah.
How will the elections held last week influence the political landscape in terms of right-wing and left-wing populism? Does the surge in populist movements in Europe have any impact on South Korean populism? What are the potential avenues for countering the challenges posed by populism and authoritarianism and strengthening democratic norms in South Korea?
Okay, sorry. I had to collect my thoughts for a minute. Well, the last week's election saw a pretty strong victory for the mainstream center-left party in South Korea, which some people call a progressive party. Some people dispute how progressive it is. That is in some ways surprising because just a few weeks earlier, the left wing of South Korea seemed to be kind of in disarray. They had a number of prominent defections and people trying to start a new political party. And in the process, a lot of dirty laundry was aired, a lot of accusations flying around about, I believe one person referred to the mainstream the mainstream center-left party as a swamp of corruption and immorality. So you had I think just 2 weeks before the election, it seemed like the Conservative Party was looking at least more put together, more in control of themselves. And what we saw in this election was that these splinter parties from the left, and these defectors did not do very well, but the mainstream center left party actually did quite surprisingly well. So the outcome of that, it could spell a period of gridlock. They have, along with the third largest party together, they have almost a supermajority. So they can, in the legislature, they can push for things, and they can push through their agenda a lot more quickly. But they still cannot, they don't have enough of a majority to overturn a presidential veto. So we could see a period of gridlock, but it also could force the President Yoon, to take a more conciliatory stance than he has thus far, which could be a good thing. He just offered a meeting with the leader of the center left party, with the Democratic Party, Lee Jae-myung, which he had steadfastly refused to do for 2 years. So it could portend a period of maybe a little bit more conciliatory compromise politics from both sides. And it'll be interesting to see what happens with some of these defector politicians if they come back to the fold. I think as far as influence from populist movements in Europe, I haven't seen a lot of connection there. Admittedly, it's not my field. I think South Korea looks to the West and Europe, and they feel very proud of what South Korea has achieved in their democracy and want to show off. They would like to be seen as one of the leaders of the smaller country democracies. And just last month, they held a summit for democracy in Seoul, which got a lot of media attention. This was heavily promoted by President Yoon and President Biden in the US. The Summit for Democracy, with various democratic countries worldwide coming together in Seoul. And the fact that it was in Seoul was I think, very important. So in that respect, I think they look to Europe and would like to be seen as an equal, a role model for the democratic movement. They would not like to be a Viktor Orban type, they would not like to have that reputation. So I think that is one thing that kind of helps to prevent backsliding.
Lastly, as an expert on North Korean politics and literature, could you provide insights into the readership and dissemination of state-produced fiction within North Korea? How does the distribution of literary works intersect with the regime's control over information and ideology? And what implications does this hold for understanding the reception and interpretation of foreign interactions among different segments of North Korean society?
So yes, this is my favorite topic, North Korean literature and how it affects the view of the outside world. So I can tell you what I've learned and what I've come to understand from talking with a few defectors North Korean defectors who've been involved in this industry, and also reading the works of South Korean scholars who study it, is that North Korea has an amazing system of state-run, state-produced literature and art. And this is in some ways dating back to the early kind of Soviet-controlled era right after the war, or even the Japanese colonial era, you could argue, because they also had some, institutions created in that era for producing literature. But anyway, there's not what you would call a samizdat tradition in North Korea of dissident writers. The idea of that doesn't make any sense. How would they even publish? Where would they find a press? But the state has a vast, and I will say seemingly efficient system for gathering up talent. Talented young writers all around the country are encouraged to compete for literary awards, and in this way they gain recognition. And there's a system where you can sign up to be something called a literary correspondent, where you have your day job, but you also write stories about the factory or the farm where you work. And if those stories get published by the party and they get attention, then you could someday become a full-time writer. And that includes the possibility of living in Pyongyang and having a much better quality of life. So in a way, it seems like a pretty good system. I'm sure there are plenty of people who are excluded from this system for political reasons, but they do have a good way of co-opting any potentially talented writers to be motivated to produce for the regime. And when you read these works, they are, I would say, kind of on the more boring edge of the socialist realist tradition of just, all of the characters are meant to be role models for either extremely good behavior or extremely bad behavior. And the message at the end that, the breakthrough always comes when the leader encourages people, or the leader comes up with the idea for the breakthrough that they were looking for. And then everyone says, oh, it's such a fantastic leader we have. It's never, no individual person ever comes up with the idea without some kind of help from the leader. But then there's a relatively small portion of this literature that talks about foreign events and foreigners, and for instance, past US presidents, and or depictions of perestroika in Moscow, depictions of traders at a convention in Singapore. Every once in a while, you'll see a story where they for some reason have to depict a foreigner or a foreign setting, and it's really interesting because these authors have clearly never seen the things that they're describing, and maybe they have some idea from the limited amount of foreign media that they might be allowed to access, but obviously their depictions are colored by their understanding of the world from this cage that they're in. So it's an interesting thing to analyze, and to see how they interpret foreign events. Just to give one example, the depictions of the summits with foreign leaders that have happened in the past, you would think that they might depict it in a fairly adversarial way, especially when the North Korean leader met with US President Jimmy Carter, a former President Carter, in the 90s. That summit has been depicted, but the President Carter is always depicted as a pretty nice guy. He's pretty, relatively speaking, for an American, he is a positive character. And the reason why is because he interacts with Kim Il-sung, and he meets Kim Il-sung and hears Kim Il-sung speak, and he is immediately won over by the greatness of the North Korean leader in the story. So the depictions of foreigners who have actually met and talked with the North Korean leader always are very positive. And I think that, they haven't written the story yet about the Trump Kim summits, but I can predict that no matter what, however they choose to depict that, they will depict the American president being very impressed by the North Korean leader and immediately becoming a good guy as a result of meeting that leader. And also, I think that they will have a wonderful time writing about the fact that President Trump kept Kim Jong-un's letters. That particular news story, I think I can see how they would write about that and just have a field day with the idea that the American president loved the letters he got from their leader so much that he would break the law to keep them. Like that's the message that they can get from that. That's pure gold for them. So I could write that story myself after I've read so much.
All right. Professor Shaw, thank you so very much.
Thank you.
Appreciate your time.
Appreciate it. Have a good day.
You too.